Hi, guys. So, we are going to start reading Matilda today. So, what I did before I got myself situated is I found a spot that I wanted to read from where I felt comfortable. So, I picked my big blue chair today, which reminds me of my comfy chair in the classroom. I have a little blanket with me. I can curl up, read my book, and start. So, we're going to start with chapter 1 now by Roald Dahl, Matilda. You ready? Okay. The reader of books. I'm on page 7 on mine. Not sure if it's different where you are. It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that he or she is wonderful. Some parents go further. They become so blinded by adoration, they manage to convince themselves their child has qualities of genius. Well, there's nothing very wrong with this. It's the way of the world. It's only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin, we're gonna be sick." School teachers suffer a good deal from having to listen to this sort of twaddle from proud parents, but they usually get their own back when the time comes to write the end of term reports. If I were a teacher, I would cook up some real scorchers for the children of doting parents. "Your son Maximilian," I would write, "is a total washout. I hope you have a family business you can push him into when he leaves school, because he sure as heck won't get a job anywhere else." That's quite a teacher. Or if I were feeling lyrical that day, I might write, "It is a curious truth that grasshoppers have the hearing organs in the side of the abdomen. Your daughter Vanessa, judging by what she's learned this term, has no hearing organs at all." I might even delve deeper into natural history and say the periodical cicada spent 6 years a grub underground and no more than 6 days a free creature of sunlight and air. Your son, Wilfred, has spent 6 years as a grub in school, and we are still waiting for him to emerge from the chrysalis. A particularly poisonous little girl might sting me and say, "Fiona has the same glacial beauty as an iceberg, but unlike the iceberg, she has absolutely nothing below the surface." I think I might enjoy writing the class end of term reports for the stinkers in my class. But enough of that. We have to get on. Occasionally, one comes across a parent who I'm sorry, occasionally one comes across parents who take the opposite line, who show no interest at all in their children. And these, of course, are far worse than the doting ones. Mr. and Mrs. Woodworm were two such parents. They had called Michael and a daughter, I'm sorry, they had a son called Michael and a daughter called Matilda. And the parents looked upon Matilda in particular as nothing more than a scab. A scab is something you have to put up with until the time comes when you can pick it off and flick it away. Mr. and Mrs. Woodworm looked forward enormously to the time when they could pick their little daughter off and flick her away, preferably into the next county or even further than that. It is bad enough when their parents treat ordinary children as though they were scabs and bunions. But it becomes somehow a lot worse when the child in question is extraordinary. And by that I mean sensitive and brilliant. Matilda was both of these things, but above all, she was brilliant. Her mind was so nimble and she was so quick to learn, and her ability should have been obvious even to the most half witted parents. But Mr. and Mrs. Woodworm were both so gormless and so wrapped up in their own silly little lives that they failed to notice anything unusual about their daughter. To tell the truth, I doubt they would have noticed if she had crawled into the house with a broken leg. Matilda's brother, Michael, was a perfectly normal boy, but the sister, as I said, was something to make your eyes pop. By the age of 1.5, her speech was perfect and she knew as many words as most grown ups. The parents, instead of applauding her, called her noisily chatterbox and told her sharply that small girls should be seen and not heard. By that time, she was 3. Matilda had taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well, and she naturally began hankering after books. The only book in the whole of this enlightened household was something called Easy cooking belonged to her mother, and when she had read this from cover to cover and learned all the recipes by heart, she decided she wanted something more interesting. So what we've learned so far, boys and girls, is that there's two types of parents: a doting parent, right, who's on top of their children and making sure that they're the best and they're great and making sure the teacher knows. And then there's parents like Mrs. and Mr. Woodworm who are kind of just like, get away from me, right? They compared parenting to like a scab, like flicking the child away when they're done. Like kind of terrible, right? Daddy, she said, do you think you could buy me a book? A book, he said. What do you want a flaming book for? To read, Daddy. What's wrong with the telly, for heaven's sake? We've got a lovely telly with a 12-inch screen, and now you come asking for a book? You're getting spoiled, my girl. What do you think a telly is? Like a television, right? Television. Nearly every weekday afternoon, Matilda was left alone in the house. Her brother, 5 years older than her, went to school. Her father went to work, and her mother went on out playing bingo in a town 8 miles away. Mrs. Boardworm was hooked on bingo and played it 5 afternoons a week. On the afternoon of the day when her father had refused to buy her a book, Matilda set out all by herself to walk to the public library in the village. When she arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. She asked if she might sit a while and read a book. Mrs. Phelps, slightly taken aback by the arrival of such a tiny girl, unaccompanied by a parent, nevertheless told her that she was very welcome. Where are the children's books, please? Matilda asked. Over there on those lower shelves, Mrs. Phelps told her. Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of pictures in it? No, thank you, Matilda said. I'm sure I can manage. From then on, every afternoon, as soon as her mother had left for bingo, Matilda would toddle down to the library. The walk took only 10 minutes, and this allowed her 2 glorious hours sitting quietly by herself in a cozy corner, devouring one book after another. When she had read every single children's book in the place, she started wandering round in search of something else. Mrs. Phelps, who had been watching her with fascination for the past few weeks, now got up from her desk and went over to her. Can I help you, Matilda? She asked. I'm wondering what to read next, Matilda said. I finished all the children's books. You mean you looked at all the pictures? Yes, but I've read the books as well. Mrs. Phelps looked down at Matilda from her great height, and Matilda looked right back up at her. I thought some were very poor, Matilda said, but others were lovely. I liked the secret garden most of all. It was full of mystery. The mystery of the room behind the closed door and the mystery of the garden behind the big wall. Mrs. Phelps was stunned. Exactly how old are you, Matilda? She asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Phelps was stunned more than ever, but she had the sense not to show it. What sort of book would you like to read next? She asked. Now, why do you think the librarian would be stunned? I'm not sure if you know any 4-year-olds, but 4-year-olds, even a 4-year old within 3 months, typically does not know how to read long books like Matilda's describing the secret garden. So that's why she kept saying, you look at the pictures, right? Matilda's like, no, I read. Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown-up book for a 4-year-old girl? Her first thought was to pick a young teenager's romance of the kind that is written for 15-year-old schoolgirls. But for some reason, she found herself instinctively walking past that particular shelf. Try this, she said at last. It's very famous and very good. If it's too long for you, just let me know and I'll find something shorter and a bit easier. Great Expectations, Matilda read, by Charles Dickens. I'd love to try it. I must be mad, Mrs. Phelps told herself. But Matilda, she said, of course you may try. You may try it. Over the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room with a book on her lap. It was it was necessary to rest it up on the lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up. She couldn't even hold the book up. So heavy, what does that tell you? It must be a very heavy or thick book, right? Which meant she had to sit forward, leaning forward in order to read. And a strange sight that it was, this tiny dark-haired person sitting there with her feet nowhere touching the floor, totally absorbed in the wonderful adventures of Pip and old Mrs. Pipsham and her cobweb house, and by the spell of magic that Dickens Dickens, the great storyteller, had woven with his words. The only movement from the reader was the lifting of the hand every now and then to turn over a page, and Mrs. Phelps was always sad when it came time for her to cross the floor and say, "It's 10 to 5, Matilda." During the first week of Matilda's visits, Mrs. Phelps had said to her, "Does your mother walk you down here every day and then take you home?" "My mother goes to Owlsbury every afternoon to play bingo," Matilda had said. "She doesn't know I come here." "That's surely not right," Mrs. Phelps said. "I think you'd better ask her." "I'd rather not," Matilda said. "She doesn't encourage reading books, nor does my father." "What do they expect you to do every afternoon in an empty house?" "Just mooch around and watch the telly." "I see. She doesn't really care what I do," Matilda said, a little sadly. Miss Phelps was concerned about the child's safety on the walk through the fairly busy village, High Street, and the crossing of the road, but she decided not to interfere. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which that edition contained 411 pages. "I loved it," she said to Mrs. Phelps. "Has Mr. Dickens written any others?" "A great number," said the astounded Miss Phelps. "Shall I choose you another?" Over the next 6 months, Mrs. Phelps watched the compassionate eye Matilda read the following books: Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and the list continues. It was a formidable list, and by now Mrs. Phelps was filled with wonder and excitement. But it was herself probably a good thing that she did not allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Almost anyone else witnessing the achievements of the small child would have to be tempted to make a great fuss and shout the news all over the village and beyond. But not so Mrs. Phelps. She was someone who minded her own business and had long since discovered it was seldom worthwhile to interfere with other people's children. So these books that were just listed here, boys and girls, I skipped over a little bit of them. These books, when I went to college for my undergrad, my bachelor's is in English, so I had to read a lot of novels. Most of the novels on this list was what I read in college. So that's what Matilda is reading, just to put that in hindsight, and she's 4. "Mrs. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand," Matilda said to her. "Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand," Matilda said to her, "especially the men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way he tells it, I feel I am right there on the spot watching it all happen." "A fine writer will always make you feel that," Mrs. Phelps said, "and don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music." "I will, I will." "And do you know," Mrs. Phelps said, "that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home?" "I didn't know that," Matilda said. "Could I do it?" "Of course," Mrs. Phelps said. When you have chosen the book that you want, bring it to me so I can make a note of it, and it's yours for 2 weeks. You can take it more than one if you wish." From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out her new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read most afternoons, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. She was not quite tall enough to reach things around the kitchen, but she kept a small box in the outhouse, which she brought in and stood on in order to get whatever she wanted. Mostly it was hot chocolate she made, warming the milk in a saucepan on the stove top before mixing it. Occasionally she made Bovril or Ovaltine. It was pleasant to take a hot drink up to her room and have it beside her as she sat in the silent room and have it beside her. In the silent room, reading in the empty house in the afternoon. The book transported her into new worlds and introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India to Rudyard Kipling. She traveled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. And that is the end of chapter 1. So, did she actually go to all those places and travel? No, but one can make the connection that she's so captivated in each book that she's actually transporting herself there, like imagination wise, and that she feels like she's been in all these places. And also something to take note of before we end this chapter is Mrs. Phelps. So let's just remember some of the characters. We have Matilda, her brother, and her two parents. We have Mrs. Phelps, who's the librarian. So those are five characters that we've been introduced to so far. It's a lot to look forward to. And Miss Phelps actually thought there was something interesting about Matilda and wanted to intervene, but then decided not to. Intervene means to like step in and to help. She's seeing a 4-year-old walk to the library by herself. That is a lot to be concerned about, but she's deciding to just take a back seat and kind of see how this plays out. Okay, I hope you enjoy chapter 1.